And Boris actually knows his stuff too. He's like, I was like, oh, I wonder if he's actually good. He was just bullshitting there.
He knows about the gladiator days and everything.
Yeah.
Where do we want to go? Welcome back to the 40k Fireside podcast. We are joined here today with a good friend of ours, Boris Michev, who owns the Bad Moon Cafe in London, which is basically the premier wargaming cafe in London. Or if you just want to go get a cocktail or coffee, maybe work there in the day, like I've done from time to time, it's a great place to go there. He's obviously our teammate as well, and we thought we'd bring him on today to talk about a couple of things because we love having guests on. In terms of housekeeping, we think that we are going to be recording an episode in a couple of days' time to talk about the international team tournament, which all three of us are participating in the same team. And then we might do a special episode with our whole team on Saturday night, perhaps, which would be really cool to recap day one. So that'll be what you can look forward to in the next couple of weeks, but I'll pass it over to Vic to introduce you about what we're going to be talking today.
All right, awesome. So a little bit of background. Most of you do know about our team, but we play for a team called Dice Down. There's 10 members, and Boris is one of the members of Dice Down. And Boris exemplifies one of the things which we've noticed a lot over the last few years, which is that people in competitive 40k jump in and out of the game. And Boris is going through a phase where he's coming back into the game. And I just want to give a little introduction before he starts to kind of talk about things. And Boris played a lot of competitive 40k between the period of 2019 and 2021, getting to the LVO top 8, getting to the LGT finals where he came second, and winning a number of GTs along the way, including the Gibraltar GT. Now, at that time, GTs of kind of 80 to 100 people are absolutely huge events. So Boris was a very accomplished 40k player. Slipped a little bit out of 40k. And Boris, why don't you introduce yourself? Welcome to the podcast.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So, Boris, just want to start off getting a bit more information from you about that period when you were playing 40k and kind of what you got up to.
So I guess I'm a bit of an exception because I'm quite a late bloomer. I think most people that play 40k did at least some when they were a kid, and maybe they came out of it and they came back later on. Mm-hmm. I only really got into 40k with the start of 8th edition, so very recently. So growing up as a kid, I had no idea what Warhammer is, and I sort of knew from the video games, Dawn of War and others, but never with the miniatures. So just as 8th edition was coming out, which was I guess 2017, maybe 18, I had a good friend from high school come to visit London. And he took me to the Games Workshop store on Tottenham Court Road, and my mind was blown. I mean, I was, 35 at the time, which probably tells my age, but, for a 35-year-old to walk into a toy store and be like, oh my gosh, what is this? Like, how do I do this?
Yeah.
And then I immediately got hooked. So I came into it pretty late, but almost immediately I got attracted to going to tournaments and events. Mm-hmm. And so, the first tournament I ever went to was LVO, which tells you how intense I get when I get into something. And, first thing is I go to LVO, and the second thing is I open up a gaming store, So you could say I sort of jumped into it, into the deep right away.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And I think, what was the, I guess we'll cover a lot of things here, but I think maybe you give us a bit of context. What was the scene like in 8th edition when you started playing?
So when I started, when I literally picked up my first start collecting box and started, Googling how do I glue these things together, and I kid you not, I was like, what do I need glue? Or I started sort of like, looking for podcasts and other, media to kind of get up to speed with the game. And nowadays, obviously, what you guys do and what others do, there's just so much good content out there that can, tell people about the tournament side of 40K and how to get into it, what to expect. At the time, there was nothing. I mean, there was one podcast, which is how I got into 40K, which was called The Best General. It was by this guy, Adam Abramowitz, which, you guys may or may not have heard of. But he created a podcast about going from sort of a casual, hobby-focused 40K player to attempting to win a grand tournament, and his goal was to win Warzone Atlanta, which is a long-standing running sort of grand tournament in the US. And I listened to it every week, and it was so good. And he described his journey. He had guests on the show to sort of help him prepare and go through the whole process. And as I was building my start collecting orcs, and doing my first painting, and he's going through the process, I got hooked. And one of my favorite things is I actually got to play Adam at round 5 at the LVO.
Awesome.
We were both 4-0, and it was the best game. And I told him, like, you're the reason why I'm here.
Yeah.
Your podcast. So, at the time there was no coaching, there was no podcast, and we're talking only about 5 years ago maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like eons ago. It just goes to show you the growth that sort of the content creation and tournament side of things has really gone through in the last few years.
So, Boris, I noticed that the timing, and I didn't actually realize this, that we pretty much started playing 40K at exactly the same time with exactly the same kind of story, just walking into a game store. And I also used to listen to The Best General every single time
That's
it came
awesome.
out.
That's
Which
awesome.
is crazy. And actually, I don't know if you remember, the key source of information at that time were this thing called forums, Daka Daka and Bolter and Chainsword.
I remember.
How things have changed. Gosh.
By the way, it's only like 5 years ago. This is what's crazy.
It's developed so much.
Even in the last year, the community has absolutely exploded as well. I noticed a remarkable difference between this time last year, or from LVO to LVO, especially in the UK, especially on the content front, it's changed a lot as well. So, Boris, I remember when I first started playing. Actually, I feel like I'm the odd one out here now. When I first started playing, you and I was playing a lot on TTS. Was lockdown. And, I went to my first tournament and I played Dan Bates round 1, Manny Chima round 2, and then I played another good player, and then I played Vic, I think round 4 or 5. And I was just like, with my admic, I was like, yeah, my list is so good, like, I'm going to smash everyone. And I got completely destroyed, as Vic and I had already detailed once. And then so I kind of went to the first tournament and thought, this is really interesting, but I really fell in love with the competitive side of the game. I thought it was such a deep game. And then, funnily enough, like, we started playing, right? Because we were at Bad Moon Cafe, and we started playing it, and I was like, I remember you beat me once as well at another kind of load-up tournament. And I was like, man, this guy seems really good. Like, this guy just crushed me with his, like, Marines, or, like, this guy's, and I kind of knew, like, this guy's really good. And I was kind of, I really wanted to get games against you and everything like that. And at the time, for me, it was, like, such a drive for 40K. I've never had that kind of period where I've had a lull so far, but I know a lot of people do go through that. And I think kind of dipping in and out of 40K, especially for people on our team, has been kind of a very common theme. And throughout everyone in the world, they go through parts of where they really enjoy the game, they're super into it. And maybe that's because an army that they like has gotten substantially better, or maybe it's because a new codex has dropped, or they're just going through a part in their life where they've got more time and a social network to play in 40K. So why don't you take us through? I guess what would be a good part is when you started dropping out of 40K relative to 9th edition, 8th edition. Like, where did that happen, and kind of what were some of the key reasons that you went kind of lost a kind of interest or a competitive edge in 40K? So say.
Yeah, I mean, different people, fall in and out for different reasons. I think that the main thing for me has been sort of quote unquote real life. I've got 3 kids under the age of 5, and I got 2 businesses, 2 jobs, if you will. And so life has just been, I've always wanted to do this thing, but go back and look at, the top 5, 10 players in the world every year. How many of them have kids? It'll be an interesting social experiment. And I know nowadays, some of the top players, have kids and so forth, but it's very hard, I find it, with young kids to maintain a sort of, a regular competitive 40K drive. I mean, what you and Vic did last year, and I was sort of, vicariously living through you guys, is, I mean, you must have each gone to, a dozen, if not more, tournaments, more than one a month, and practicing in between and reading up and staying up to date with podcasts and, releases and army crafting. And, I just, as I went from 1 kid to 2 kids to 3 kids to 2 jobs, I just, there's just no capacity in my days to do all of that. So for me, the main reason has been, just, life has gotten in the way. I keep making this joke, when my kids go to college, I'll be back on the circuit, in 15 years as the oldest, ITC. Um, but I don't tend to come in and out of the game based on factions being strong or weak. As you know, like when I come back, I wouldn't play for like 8 or 9 months. I'll pick up one of the armies that I have. I'll play like 10 games in a week, and then I'll go to a tournament and hope to do well. Um, my kids are now getting sort of to an age where, I'll allow myself maybe a couple of events a year. Like I'll go to the Games Workshop GTs that have now started. I love the team event. But I can't really sort of compete in the true sense of the word as I did when, before I had kids or when life was a little bit more normal.
So that's really interesting way of putting it. So it's not really the balance of the game that put you off it and made you step out. It was purely a time constraint thing, and the fact that if you did want to compete, you wouldn't be able to compete at the level you wanted to. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Dave and I have talked about this a lot, but I've long ago come to terms with the fact that 40K isn't a perfect competitive discipline. There's just no ifs and no buts about that. Like sometimes it's better and sometimes it's worse, but when you compare it to traditional sports or esports or other competitive disciplines, clearly 40K is significantly flawed in it's not ever designed as a pure competitive system. And I've come to terms with that, and I'm okay with that. And what that means is that like sometimes certain armies are much stronger than others, and sometimes certain units are much stronger. And obviously, to compete at the top level, there's an element of like, can I have 20 Scarab Code Terminators, 15 Flamers, and 3 characters next weekend? And obviously, that is a time commitment in and of itself. You guys know that I'm quite serious about my hobby and my painting, and I love reading the books. And so for me, there's just certain elements of the meta chase that I haven't like ever signed up for, and I've never judged anyone for doing it. I fully respect that, but it hasn't always been for me. So I've done well when like my armies that I have are strong. I feel confident that I can, play 10 games in a week, go for a weekend, and actually compete if my armies is kind of up there. But I certainly don't have the time to do what I described
as competing. Yeah, and I think that kind of problem of people who, and I think Vic and I are obviously me more so than Vic for lack of health in terms of what I think is some people only like to compete at their absolute best, and they like to compete and like to win, of course. And I think obviously, you kind of fall into that camp as well. If you can't put your best foot forward and be at the point where you can be playing at your apex and winning and podiuming, then kind of what's the point, so to say? And I think Vic, you got a bit more healthier mentality than I do in that. But I've kind of come to that realization recently as well, is that you don't actually have to win anything. Like I don't feel like I necessarily have to prove anything anymore per se, which has led me to kind of play a little bit easier and enjoy the game in different aspects. But where I'm going with this is that I noticed that when you kind of when you definitely had your kids and especially with your third son, right? Well, not third son, but your latest child, your son, is that you actually got mega big into the hobby side of things. Now I know you've been into the kind of hobby and the lore side of things, but guys, Boris just started dropping like insanely good painting like photos and like dioramas and like Lord of the Rings stuff and like fantasy stuff and like everything in our chat. And like, for example, Boris just posted some World Eaters rhinos recently that he's been doing, and they're like absolutely mint crisp. Like Boris is like, yeah, I want to go for like best painted and all this stuff, which obviously takes a huge amount of hobby time. But I guess what's the difference between competing and like just painting to like, not painting as competing, but painting to where you want to paint your best, right? Like there's some similarities there between competing and wanting to paint your best and have your best.
Absolutely. It's 100% driven by the social and time availability. Like I do all my painting in the evenings when my kids, like I'll put my kids to bed. My wife likes to go to sleep early. It's like between the hours of like 10 and midnight, I'll just sit and paint a lot of nights. Same on weekends, evenings. But the thing about tournaments is like you're gone the whole weekend. There is no world in which I can leave my wife with 3 kids for the weekend multiple times a year or a month. It's just not something that, at the moment. Whereas, painting, you can sort of sneak out a couple hours in the evening. Kids are watching TV. You can get some painting done. So it's a little bit more, well, it's a lot more conducive to, the family aspects. And, because we all love the hobby and we're so addicted to it, when you can't go to tournaments, for me, the answer has been, I do more painting.
Yeah, yeah.
I saw in person the point when Boris stepped out of 40K.
Ah,
It was at the Beachhead Brawl, which is in the south part of England.
Oh, yeah.
Boris, the entire day, had been complaining, saying, like, I feel like such a bad husband. I'm not with my kids. Why am I here playing with toy soldiers? And at the end of the day, he played a game and he's skipped the second day and just went back home to his family. And I think you stepped out of 40K immediately after that, didn't you?
Yeah, that was it. That was the last, and the story is even better than that because I had painted this beautiful GSC army, and I was so excited. And I didn't play any games before the tournament because obviously I didn't have any time. And I turned up, and it was the first ever games I ever played with GSC. But I was very happy with how I painted him. I won my first game. I won my second game. And I'm sort of feeling guilty, calling my wife and texting my wife, but because I'm winning, it's sort of like, wow, maybe I'm just another. And then round
still
three,
got it.
and then round three, I get matched up into Vic, and it was Tau versus GSC, which, I think of all the games, well, that's not true. There's been some other games, but like of all the games where I was just like, I just can't win this. I'm playing probably the best player in the UK. This is when Tau was just released, and they were like mega strong, and I'm playing an army that like is -3 to charge them every time, gets shot off the board, and I think they slapped me in like half an hour, and then I told Will, my friend who my partner at the bottom, when I was like, we're going home. Not only am I abandoning my family, but I'm getting slapped. So, let's go.
To bring in some positivity, like I think a lot of people would resonate with this. Vic and I, despite not having families, like I think every 40K pusher, I think there's a good description of it. Pusher is pushing competitively, runs into this problem of, realistically speaking, like this takes up a lot of time.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any like tips that you think would help someone, like maybe say they're in the same position as you and are time constrained or what like that? Like maybe, I don't know, have you got any advice that you would say to keep them in the game and still keep them interested and still kind of enjoying the tournaments and very much the social side of 40K?
Yeah, I would say team events. My number one advice would be there's more. For years and years and years, the only team event was sort of the ETC, WTC, kind of this sort of semi-obscure, world championship that you only could read about in some like dark web forums, and it was, no one knew about it, but there was sort of like a Team England, and everyone said it's the best thing. But over time, there's more and more team events, and I just like, if you can only do one or two events a year, I would greatly encourage people to, in the UK now, we're going to have at least 2 or 3 pretty large team events, and just going with your buddies. And when you're not going, like, if you only have 1 or 2 armies and they're done, they're not at the best at the time, but you sort of still want to compete, like the team format offers such a good, just environment for you to go there. And I love playing Drukhari, and I'll bring my Drukhari, and is a part of a 5-man team. Yeah, at any given time, your 1 or 2 armies are probably going to be very viable. So it offers a great sort of middle ground of, you can still compete, you can still enjoy the social aspect, and just through the pairing system in a team event, even if you lose, but you score a few more points than you thought you would, you're helping the team. So it puts competitive 40K in a completely different light, and I love that. I mean, so much that the last time I played 40K was this time last year at the ITT, and
exactly.
12 months later, here I am again. So
just for listeners, this episode is being recorded before the international team tournament, which all 3 of us are playing in the same team, and it's also recorded before Dave, our captain, has thrown Boris under the bus for 6 rounds in a row.
But you know what? I got world eaters, and when you have world eaters, you cannot not have a good time.
you're getting shot off the board, you're getting points. You know, you're killing some things, you're getting points. Like, you know, as long as there's blood on the battlefield.
Exactly, it's the perfect, like, I'm killing you and you're killing me, and we're both having fun
Yeah.
because we're both scoring points.
I mean, we've got to bring it back to something more positive now. You've just mentioned the World Eaters, and kind of things have been rekindled for you. We have our Dice Down WhatsApp group, and Boris's activity in that group has been phenomenal over the past month or so. What's kind of brought on this resurgence of interest in the game?
So I'm a big Horus Heresy nerd. You know, I've read all the novels. I love that part of the 40K, well, I guess the Warhammer lore. And over time, the World Eaters have become my favorite legion from the Heresy era. So I started, you know, as a Sons of Horus fanboy, and then Thousand Sons. And then, you know, the more and more books I read, and especially now into the Siege of Terra, I just love the World Eaters. I don't like 40K World Eaters, but the 30K World Eaters and their story, and, you know, Angron is by far the coolest Primarch. And so when they announced that the World Eaters code is coming out, I was just so pumped. And initially, you know, it was only ever going to be like a hobby project, just, you know, paint it up and, you know, maybe play a couple of games on the weekend with buddies. But because it's sort of, the team tournament was around the corner, and based on the initial sort of leaks and previews and stuff, I was like, this looks pretty good.
Yeah.
And so it sort of, everything fell into place where, you know, the team tournament was coming. You know, my favorite legion was getting a new book. The rules seem pretty good. The models are epic. So like everything sort of came together. So I'm like, okay, I'm back for 2 weeks.
That's true. And actually, that just segues well, because we were going to cover the World Eaters in this episode, actually, and I thought, who better to get than Boris on here? And just as a preface, Boris has already smashed me in a practice game in Bad Moon Cafe on a Friday afternoon. So, World Eaters, they're not bad. They're not bad. But I'm going to come at from the perspective of, I still don't know exactly what your army does, because that's usually how I played most of my games. So World Eaters, what's that? At first, okay, Boris, you said, you know, I'm gonna call you out here a little bit. You said, you know, I was always a World Eaters fan, just when they happen to be strong, you know. But you did drop some 30K lore, some 40K lore, some Horus Heresy lore in there. So what actually is it about World Eaters that got you excited?
Well, from, you know, like everyone who, you know, gravitates to army, you've always liked them since you were a kid. That's sort of the, you know, that's the rule of, you know, but no, joking aside, from a lore perspective, the story of Angron, I find the most, I guess, compelling stories of all the Primarchs. And initially, like, the World Eaters in 40K have this kind of, people have this misconception that they're this sort of blood crazed, you know, corn possessed, mindless freaks that just want to, you know, but in 30K, obviously they're a lot different. It's before they, you know, go through that transformation. And you know, their story about the Butcher's Nails and Angron's, you know, life as a slave, and the tribulations that they go through is just a very compelling sort of sci-fi narrative. From a gaming perspective, you know, when the rules started being released, I sort of like, you know, now that I'm almost 40 and have limited time to study the game and play, I love that the rule set is very simplified, but it's deep enough to where if you master the army with a relatively simple rule set, you can actually do some pretty amazing things on the tabletop. And that really, really appealed to me. Where I get lost is like the Admech Codex, where there's like 76 command phase buff and 12 named characters that each gives a buff. And that I sort of like, I can't compute with that anymore.
Those are Dave's armies. Command phase is 90% of his game.
Yeah,
IQ phase.
World Eater's command phase? Nothing. World Eater's psychic phase? Nothing. World Eater's shooting phase? Nothing. That's my kind of army.
So to the listener out there, if you are interested, if that ticks all your boxes, which would be one box because you like the melee phase and you like things dying and you like to charge people, then stick around. We're going to cut it to. I'm going to segue us. We're going to.
Are you going to segue it? Go for
there we go. Part 2, where we're going to catch up with
music.
Boris. He's going to talk us all about World Eaters if you want to check them out, maybe get into them, and what they bring to the team environment. So we'll catch you right after this.
Okay, so we're back with a bit more World Eaters chat because we want to chat with Boris not only a little bit more about the army but also about where it fits into the team format. So, Boris, you mentioned that World Eaters are a surprisingly non-one-dimensional faction in terms of their lore. Now, the way you described World Eaters at the end of the last section was fairly one-dimensional, but is it the same kind of thing? Are they also more complex than they appear? Do they have more value than they appear?
I mean, fundamentally, they are what people refer to as a one-phase army, right? All they do is charge and combat, right? And traditionally in 40K, it's rare that monophase armies do well. There's been some shooting armies that do well over time, but generally the armies that have tended to do well have been armies that do multiple things in multiple phases of the game. So inherently, world eaters are limited in that sense, and it's very hard to balance a rule set in 40K that only does one thing, right? And so I think that puts like a big asterisk to them in that they are monophase and all they do is just punch. But I think Games Workshop have done such a clever design of their rule set and their secondary missions in this current Arcs of Omen season that it doesn't feel like you are as hamstrung by being a monophase army as you might be otherwise. I mean, we're coming off, Blood Angels winning LVO, so maybe there are combat armies that can do well in a specific event. But I think to answer your question, they are straightforward in that they have only 5 or 6 stratagems, only one warlord trait, really one relic sort of thing, and 4 data sheets. So in that sense, it's a very compact rule set, and then it's 100% what do you do with that on the table. And I have now maybe 10 games with them, and it's as a classic combat army, it's mastering the movement phase and mastering the combat phase is just so much fun.
It really is the deepest part of 40K. To in all honesty, right, the combat phase and the movement. Well, obviously the movement phase because it determines where your army is going to be. But the combat phase really allows for the most amount of player expression and minutia. I think, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think one of the things that I think most people typically look at when they think of is this army going to be powerful or not? For me personally, it's if you were only to pick one thing, I'd have to say it's secondaries, right? I think we've seen over the past year a couple of armies that have done particularly well simply because their secondaries have been pretty busted. So obviously we all know Necrons. Thousand Suns was a little bit like that as well, access to very strong secondaries. And then we had the counterpoint where we had Tyranids, which had bad secondaries but had really good data sheets. So there's kind of two contrasts, I think, two relative themes to the game in a lot of sense. And then we've also had Tau, who have had kind of good secondaries, and we're also kind of a mono-ish phase army as well. So why don't you run us through the secondaries and why you think they're good? What are the strengths there?
So when the Arcs of Omen GT book came out, I mean, you guys know this because I said it only about 100 times in the chat. But when the book first came out, I was like, this is 45 out of 45 every single game. I read him like 5 times. And at the time, we didn't really know what blood tide points mean. So the third secondary, we couldn't really tell how good it is. But once the codex came out, I was like, yeah, this is crazy. There's no other faction. And, having played, as I said, about 10 games with him now, is my opinion has changed a bit. I still think they have the best secondaries in the game as a suite of like 3 faction-specific secondaries. They're incredible. They can also do some of the generic secondaries, especially the kill secondaries if your opponent gives it up very well as well. It's not 45 out of 45 every game, but I haven't had any games, even the games where I've lost with them, where I've scored less than like 40, maybe 39.
Nice.
Yeah, which is a super strong game for going into a game, right? You're like, well, I'm already going to score like 75 points, so that's where the bar is, right? You need to meet me at 75.
Yeah, and our UKTC terrain, which is what everyone's playing nowadays here, you could it's very hard to deny World Eaters player primary points. We should have started with that, but World Eaters is the kind of army that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on your opponent. Literally, turn 1, you're in their deployment zone with 600 points of combat. Turn 2, you're in their deployment zone with 800 points of combat. Okay, in most games, you could literally have a single spawn sitting on your back objective, scoring your primary points because the opponent is like, I literally have this. What is this in my deployment zone? I'm getting tabled. I need to deal with this. So they're actually very hard to deny primary against, and they themselves are very good at denying primary because you put so much OPSEC, so much combat on objectives with heroic intervention fights on that. So they're a very high scoring army as a result of that. Really good secondaries can score their own primary and also deny opponent primary as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned a couple of the strats there. I think stratagems are, I think, a very initial place that people go to when they look at codexes. They go, do they have this generic stratagem? Do they have the access to this one? Do they fight on death? Do they have heroic? Do they have advance and charge, right? Which is like probably the biggest one that you look for. What are the kind of the most, out of the 10 games you play, like what are the most common strats you use and which ones you really think are the powerhouses?
So unlike other codices, I mean, people are speculating that this is, is this the way forward for GW for codex design? But World Eaters, you only get 8 stratagems. Well, you get 8, and then you get another 8 if you play the Army of Renown, which is a little bit of a corner case. But you only get 8 stratagems, but 6 of them you use every game. So it's very, or 6 of them you use in 75% of games, I would say. Yeah. So they've gone with we're not going to do 3 pages of stratagems, 90% of which you're never going to use. Here's 8 of them, of which 6 are really, really good.
Yeah.
So the ones that I use every game is +1 damage on my 8-bound or Terminators, which is incredible. It takes them from damage 2 to damage 3, which is obviously a very powerful breakpoint. 6-inch heroic intervention for core units on your 8-bound in your Khorne Berserkers. Use it every game, or at least the threat of it every game comes up. 6 is to wound, do additional mortal wounds, when you're throwing so many attacks and you need a few more mortal wounds to sort of guarantee a kill or get through a tougher defensive profile. You use that. Fight on death for a core unit. Use it every single game. And then 3d6 charge, drop the lowest for Khorne Berserkers and Jackals with an icon. Use that pretty much every single game. And then you have a couple of situational ones, -1 to hit on your Rhinos, or, get some blood tide points if you kill the Warlord. But as you can see, it's only 5 or 6 stratagems, but you either use them every game or the threat of your ability to use them kind of helps dictate play.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head where a lot of codexes these days have probably 50% of their stratagems are very niche and or not really used. And correct me if I'm wrong, but World Eaters don't really have access to multiple relics or warlord traits. Is that correct?
Yeah, you only get the one of each.
Nah, that's a shame. Yeah. Which is typically in codexes these days, that's also built into their stratagem pages, and it takes up like 4 stratagems as well, right?
But you can only, not only do you can only take one of each, but you can only choose from 3 warlord traits and 3 relics. So you're limited both in your, ability to take them and, the field from which you can take them. So it's, as I said, it's very streamlined.
Makes you wonder if this is the kind of inclination of 10th edition coming in, where codexes get smaller, more compact, and their release dates are potentially sped up and what like that. They make the cycle faster or something, right?
I can't help but feel, Boris, listening to everything you've just said there, a one-phase army that applies massive pressure and has very good secondary scoring. It sounds awfully like a teams list to me. What do you think for the teams format? I mean, we're playing 5s, but maybe it could be applied to 8s as well. How do you think World Eaters fits into that?
Yeah, I mean, you guys would know better than me, but I cannot think of another army that I've ever played with or played against where you actively score points by dying. It's honestly, in the first few games that I played, I would like hide my spawn. I just used to like, okay, I can tuck in the spawn behind this ruin and my fire berserkers. And then by game 2, 3, 4, 5, I would literally like take the spawn, put it at the very front of the objective and say, please shoot this. This is 3 points. And so as a result, in most matchups, you can guarantee that the World Eaters player isn't going to get 20-0 or 15-5, or 13-7 even. And no matter how bad it gets, obviously there's some really hard matchups that we can go into, but in most matchups, you can reliably say we can get 10 points here or 9 points here, which is, for a captain and someone doing the pairings, just to know that like in 8 out of these 10 matchups, I can throw the World Eaters players and they're just going to score points. That's a great asset to have.
I also think there's another little bit of special power here that we have in having you here with us in this team tournament, Boris. And we did a previous interview with a player called Anthony Vanella, like top 10 IDC, brilliant player. And he was talking about what he felt about UK players and their potential weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses he mentioned was that the players in the UK, especially the top good players, are much less able to deal with severe pressure being applied on them. And I don't know if that's because of our terrain format always being so balanced that, if you do put your whole army in someone's face, which is very much sounds like how World Eaters are going to do it, hopefully, we have a chance of more blowout games, which is very, very powerful in fives.
Yeah. I mean, a few of the, my practice games so far, and I've had practice games against Malik, Dave, George. Like I've had practice games against good players playing top lists, and you can have blowout games. I mean, in some of these matchups, if you go first, and I know like going first used to be this sort of like horrible thing back in the day where like we had no terrain and we had gun lines, and going first meant like, okay, I'm just gonna get shot off the board. But going first with World Eaters, your opponent asks you and you explain to them that, okay, in the corners deployment maps, I will be at the end of my movement phase on your home objective with 600 points of combat. Okay, that's where my army will end up before I declare my charges. Okay, these 2 units will move 22, and that 1 unit will move 24 inches. And you point to them exactly where you're gonna end your movement, and you put like a dice there. Okay, and then you watch them deploy their army, right? And they're like, well, I could go all the way back in the corner, and then I'll score no points, or I can front line, and then on a 50-50, maybe I just get 20 old. So it does play, what I found with the pregame move, Warlord Trait, which is, kind of the only way to really play them, at least for now. I don't turn one charge, maybe I turn one charge half the time I go first, but the threat of it, right, and how your opponent deploys, you just, okay, you want to go in the back corner? I'll take my first turn and I'll take the entire midboard, okay, with my whole army. And then guess what? Turn 2, the pain train's coming.
Yeah. Or even turn 3 if they can't come up far enough, right? And then it's just like, well, you have to table me in 2 turns now and catch up in the game, which is a tough spot to be in, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think it is kind of reminiscent to Necrons, but I thought it just seemed very similar to Blood Angels. Obviously, you have the pre-game move with Death Company, and you get points when they die, and it's just killing stuff and whatnot like that, right? So that to me was the direct similarity.
I think the difference with the Death Company was you could only ever do it on 1 unit, right? If I'm not mistaken. And so, 1 unit of Death Company can do a lot of damage, but you could sort of, you could sort of deal with that a little bit. Whereas when you have 5 or 6 8 bound, and the Lord on the flying magical unicorn juggernaut all hitting you, like the damage potential is just. When I played against one of our teammates playing Knights on Dawn of War, and he backlined his army, I killed 5 Knights turn 1, 5 baby Knights turn 1, and touched the other 2 in turn 1 on Dawn of War. And it's 5 Death Companies and doing that, right?
Yeah, and so I agree with Vic actually that it strikes me as an army that has the potential for a high upswing, and your opponent doesn't need to play tight, especially in the early turns in the game. Because once the early turns are over, you can sort of map out the movement for World Eaters. Move blocking is very strong against them.
Yes.
But that potential for a turn 1 blowout, if they make a mistake, is pretty big. And in a team tournament format where you get put right on the back foot on turn 1 in a matchup, maybe you should be drawing or winning, then it kind of throws your whole game plan completely out the window, because all of a sudden you're thinking, actually, how do I salvage this to be an 8-12 instead of what I thought was going to be an 11-9 or something like that, right? So it's huge potential threat for a big differential, which in a 5-man tournament where all the armies are quite close, I think, is potentially a powerful weapon in your arsenal.
So yeah, and the other thing is, top players don't know how to screen, right? Like I got this servitor unit here in my book corner, and it's 9 inches, and I got these infiltrators here, and you can drop in. But the World Eaters pregame move is, I'm moving 22 inches and you can't stop me because I can end within 9. Um, and so, of course, there's some armies that can just like string out some, cheap string out, 20 guardsmen. And then the only thing you can hit is guardsmen, and everything else there's 3 inches back, so you can't be touched after that, or you can put the scarabs. There's, of course, some armies that could just put cheap bodies in the way and be a speed bump. But so many of the armies in the game right now just don't have that, right?
You're
Uh,
hitting
and,
the roof.
and, and turn one, you're hitting Lemon Russes. In turn one, you're hitting, crisis units. In turn one, you're hitting, or they're in their back corner, and then they're not scoring.
Yeah. I mean, we've been singing the praises for a lot of positivities of this army, but what are some of the drawbacks? I think going second seems to be quite a, potentially bad spot, right? Like, because you're a melee combat army, can you get out onto staging positions when your opponent's already had a turn and will have another turn before they potentially shoot or engage you, right?
Yeah, so the worst case scenario is you go second into a very fast, very killy army that that can just get angles in you and just blow you off the board. So, some of these Raven Wing armies, even the Votan bikes, like some of the lists in the ITT are 18 Votan bikes.
Yeah.
If you go second and each one of them pre-games 12 inches and then they move 12 inches in their movement phase, they'll get angles in your army unless you've put everything behind your corner L, at which point you've lost the game.
Yeah.
And there's no coming back from that. It is at that stage, terminal. They'll kill 3, 4, 500 points of your army in for shooting phase because world eaters are not resilient. They're like a little bit resilient. So they're not like glass cannons. They have good toughness, multiple wounds, an invuln save.
Yeah, they're like toughness 5 Marines that have like an invuln save, like 5 up or 6 up, and access to maybe a feel no pain. Right?
Exactly. So they're a little bit tough, but for where the game is as far as like killing potential right now with some of these armies, they are not resilient. So going second, even on a UKTC, which is a very good, terrain set for melee armies, especially on some of the missions, going second into a fast shooting army is just terminal. The other kind of impossible matchup is if you hit a data sheet that you just can't beat in melee, right? Like these bonded knights that are -1 damage, 4-up invuln, transhuman, and it's just like, well, I have put my whole army into one of these knights and I don't kill it. Then, you could hit a brick wall with the World Eaters where there's not that many of them, but, Dark Angels Terminators with access to -1 damage and transhuman and 4-up invulns and feel no pains. If you can't get through them in one activation in melee, you're in trouble.
So what I've gathered from the last 10 minutes is we don't put you against Dark Angels, whether it's bikes or Terminators.
Yeah, and I think the other problem with Dark Angels is the worst matchup. I think even more so than it's like this, fast shooting or whatever. If you're playing an opponent with an elite army that is very resilient and you can't kill, the army just stops functioning because the entire codex is built around these blood type points that you generate from dying and killing your opponent. They sort of power up your army and they help you score points. If nothing's dying from the opponent, like if they have, 3 Hecaton fortresses and 18 bikes, they have 6 units in total. That is a disaster. Even if you go first, because they could just deploy everything at the back because they're so fast. And then even if you reach the midfield in their first turn, they just blow you out. So like very elite small unit count armies that you can't kill is destroys the secondary scoring game of the World Eaters.
That's interesting. So how question, because I genuinely don't know, of course, is that how can you play a passive game? Can you sit around and play super cagey and still score like 25 points on your secondaries?
One of them you score 15 in every game. That's the one where you discard the blood type points. Literally, if you put your army on the line and you got tabled turn 1, you score 15 points. I'm not exaggerating.
Done.
My army generates, I think, 22 blood type points just by me dying, and I need to discard 9 of those to score 15 points. So,
okay.
So one of them you score 15 on. The other one requires you to die on objectives and your opponent to die on objectives. So, that one is usually like a solid 10 or a 12, even if you're getting battered by just putting a unit on objective and dying every turn. You get a point for that.
Yeah.
And then the third one really requires you to kill the opponent. You get points for killing the opponent.
Okay.
Could you take something else instead of that, like some of the, generic ones? The army doesn't really do like
It's not
retrieve
passive,
data.
is it?
Yeah, you could do banners, you could do
Mm.
banners with
Mm.
this army as well. But it's hard to have a truly passive game and score well. It does require you to go out, kill and die,
Yeah. Yeah.
more so than sit behind a wall and score.
Okay. Yeah. It's
It's going to
interesting.
be super interesting, and I think you're going to catch people off guard, and I think people are going to have fun playing against you as well.
But
So
that's
this
the other
will
thing.
be
People,
interesting.
people haven't yet had the time to sort of, maybe someone heard
Mm.
someone talk about it on a podcast or watched the bat rep. But like, I mean, Dave, it was your first time playing the other day, and everyone else that I played, obviously this week in preparing for the event, was their first time playing it. And the first time you play it, it's like, I mean, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah, there's a lot of stuff that will catch people out. Like, there's a lot of intricacies between: do you shoot units on objectives? Do you place your units on objectives? Do you kill stuff? Do you die on objectives? The heroics, the pre-game moves and stuff like that. Like, it's definitely one of those armies that I feel has the biggest edge when people don't know or haven't practiced against them. And I think
Yep.
there's a few armies that were very good, especially maybe last year, or the year before, that were very good when people didn't have experience playing with them. And as soon as people played one or two games, their power level drastically dropped. Grey Knights really stood out for me like that with all the Nemesis Dread Knights. I know once people started playing a few games in, they're like, okay, I kind of worked it out what's going on here now. Had a few like really tricky parts to it. As opposed to some armies that just have raw power, and it doesn't really matter if you figure them out. You just kind of you need to be respected based on the game plan that you can operate on the board.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, in our game, we had this interaction where I had 5 berserkers strung between 2 objectives, and you're like, right, I'm going to shoot them. And I was like, well, here's what happens if you shoot them. If you kill them, I score 4 points, 1 for each objective, and 2 blood tide points, which I'm going to turn into 2 points. So that's 4 points if you kill them. Also, if you don't kill them with the first activation, I'll move D6 and touch your tank, which is standing right here.
Yeah.
Right, which will deny you shooting anywhere else. If you don't kill them, I'm going to score 8 primary. And so it was like the army operates in a way where like killing your opponent isn't like always that obvious, which plays mind games with people,
Stuff. Yeah.
Really interesting. And Boris, I just want to bring it back a second to actually like the main topic of our podcast. And I mean, we've talked about the World Eaters, we've talked about you coming back into 40K, and I just wanted to get your insight into how you feel now that we're going into your first event since coming back, going to the international team tournament, going with your team. Are you excited? How are you feeling?
I have to say, I'm generally not a person that gets nervous before like tournaments or 40K games. And I tend to perform very well under
Under pressure?
stress and pressure. But I'm like, I was looking at the list today, and I was like, there's a lot there's a lot of scary stuff out there. And obviously I haven't played for a year. I was like, am I just gonna get blown out like in some of these games? So I'm obviously super excited to hang out with with the team and see everyone else in the community. I mean, we know, I've been out of the game in and out for a while now, but when I go through the teams, I still know maybe, I don't know, 30-40% of the field of people that are going there. So that part is great. Obviously I'm a little bit apprehensive, like I don't want to let my team down. If you remember last year, I took GSC, and I had GSC for the team event, and I felt like similar. I was like, it's kind of a snowflake army. I don't know, am I gonna let the team down? But in my practice games this week, I was like, okay, this army has real power and real legs. Like, it's gonna win some games. So
I think World Eaters suits you better than GSC does from an outsider's perspective in terms of your ability to practice it and go to a tournament. I think it's obviously it's a lot easier to practice World Eaters than GSC and take it to a tournament as well. Right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
I think you're in a better position than you were last year. You're in a better position now, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And it's outcome independent anyway. We're going there to have a great time, and it's going to be a very, very good event. We are going to be discussing the international team tournament, looking through some of the top teams and lists a little bit in more detail in our upcoming podcast episode before the end of the week. So, guys, you can tune into that. But I think it's probably the right time for us to say thank you to Boris for being an awesome guest and running us through a slightly different topic to what we usually do on the podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. As Vic said, we'll be chatting about the team tournament. We're going to try and get an episode out on. We'll try and record an episode on Saturday. That'd be really cool. Let us know, maybe in the comments, if you guys don't mind having a bit more of like a raw, uncut version, because we could potentially record something on Saturday and then just push it straight. So if that's okay with you guys, let us know what your thoughts are. But yeah, Boris, any closing messages that you want to say?
Well, no, thank you very much for having me. You guys have an amazing podcast, and it's been really fun this last season to kind of, as I said, live vicariously through you and follow your success on the tournament scene. And yeah, I'm excited to see you guys in person again this weekend and play some 40K.
Cheers, Boris. You are awesome, and thank you to everyone who's listened up to this point. We'll see you at the Fireside next time.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the 40K Fireside podcast. Vic and I hope you've enjoyed listening, and we greatly appreciate any feedback that you can provide after the show.